The Secrets of Movies and TV Shows is brought to you by the StarQuest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give.
You're listening to The Secrets of Movies and TV Shows. Hello, I'm Thomas Salerno, and you're listening to The Secrets of Masters of the Air, the Apple TV miniseries from the production team behind the acclaimed World War II military dramas Band of Brothers and The Pacific. And be sure to follow The Secrets of Movies and TV Shows. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcast app or directory of choice. And you can also follow us on the StarQuest YouTube channel. And please do us a favor by sharing our podcast with all your friends. And you can find StarQuest on social media, too. We're at facebook.com/StarQuestMedia, or on X, where we are at SQPN, or on Instagram, where we are at StarQuest Network. And joining me on tonight's panel are Dom Bettinelli. Hello, Dom.
Hello, Thomas.
And Patrick Mason. Hello, Pat.
Howdy, Thomas.
All right. So I have a brief summary here, which I have adapted from what Wikipedia had to say about this show. Masters of the Air is based on the 2007 book of the same name by Donald L. Miller and follows the actions of the 100th Bomb Group, the Bloody 100th, a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress heavy bomber unit in the 8th Air Force based in eastern England during World War II. The miniseries follows bomber crews on dangerous missions to destroy targets inside of German-occupied Europe, and it portrays the intensity of war, the dangers that the airmen face, and the friendships and relationships that develop. All right, so I think all three of us have seen Band of Brothers and the Pacific, right?
I have, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's so hard to compare these shows. But actually, before I get into that, Pat, I know you have a personal family connection to the topic of this miniseries, right?
So my grandfather on my father's side, Red Wallace Mason, but he was called Red by everybody, including in the military archives. If you look him up, it says Red. He was a pilot in the Army Air Corps prior to it becoming the Air Force, and he flew B-24 Liberators, so different from the Flying Fortresses in this movie, or in this TV show, out of Atterbridge, which is an airfield in England, into Germany, France and Germany during World War II. He had a pretty long history of flying. Prior to that, he flew P-51s in training, as well as some claim that he crashed a B-24 while in training.
Wow.
Yeah. And he flew a number of missions, including on D-Day, and he was shot down at one point. Now, there is a disagreement between my uncles as to where and when he got shot down, and I don't know who's got the right story. It's possible that he was shot down over Poland and was repatriated through the Russians, effectively. The original story I heard was he was shot down over France in the German-occupied portion and got repatriated through Spain. And then my dad hit me with this a couple of days ago. He said, no, he did get shot down in France, but it was during D-Day, and he landed on one of the beaches and got repatriated right away. And I was like, okay, I've got to find out the truth here.
Wow.
That is the luckiest guy around.
Yeah.
Imagine if it's all three are true at different points.
It's possible he flew with 3 different air groups. He was in the 8th Air Force, and he did fly 2 different planes, Nobody's Baby, and then Ain't Misbehavin'. And then Misbehavin' was spelled 2 words, Miss, M-I-S, and then Behaving.
Of course.
Nice.
Probably with some suitable nose art on that plane, I think.
And then, if I remember correctly, the nose art is actually one of the lieutenants on board was his wife.
Nice. That's awesome.
And that's on that side of the family. On my wife's side, her grandfather on her dad's side flew B-24 Liberators out of North Africa over Italy. And he had 17 bombing runs, both bombing near the front line and into several cities like Vienna. He's got those written down. No crash landings, except during training. He did have to bail out while in training. Said he landed about a foot or two from a large cactus. And he wasn't the pilot. He was a technical sergeant, so he was primarily navigation and Top Gunner. But he did have to free stuck bombs on occasion, and he had to do that on at least one occasion. He had to walk on that tiny little platform in between the bombs and unhook it. Because you couldn't land with a live bomb, right? You had to get rid of them.
Yep.
So.
Wow.
A lot of history in these aircraft.
Yeah. Wow, that's amazing.
That is wild.
But basically, both of me and my wife owe our existence to them making.
No kidding. No kidding. Wow.
I remember, Pat, when you and I were talking while we were before another recording, I think it was for Secrets of Middle Earth or something. We were talking about watching this show. You were like to me, this has been like a religious experience watching this show because of the family connection. Yeah.
Very much so. Very much so.
Yeah. So what did you guys think of the series overall? Both like as well, we'll start with just it on its own, not comparing it to anything, but just on its own as a series. Dom, what are your kind of general thoughts about it?
I really enjoyed this. It was fantastic, just on its own. I'm a male over the age of 50, so I'm a World War II history buff now, and and I also smoke a lot of meat. That's a different podcast, but so I've been reading a lot of World War II history. I got to admit, I read World War II history when I was in high school too. I've always been a fan of history. Got that from my dad, but I really enjoyed watching this and seeing it because I wanted to know more about the experience of the airmen. I've seen plenty of movies and I've seen other older movies about the air war in World War II, but I wanted to see a modern, a newer take by this group. And I don't want to get into the comparing yet, by this group of show runners and creators. And it was good. Like the actors, I really enjoyed all the actors. I had some characters that I liked more than others, but all of the characters had moments that were good. They had their moment to shine, even when there may have been a character I didn't really. I'm like, because there were times where I'm like, enough of this guy. Let's go back to talk about this guy. What happened to him? Tell me about Buck.
Yeah. This Buck goes away, and you're like, oh, come on. We can't just. Come on, there's got to be more.
Exactly. So that's overall, I really like this series.
What about you, Pat? What were your kind of general impressions?
Oh, I loved it from start to finish. I think they did a fantastic job with the cinematography, with the dialogue, with the pacing, with the music. It was difficult for me not to cry pretty much every episode, given my familial connection to this kind of thing. It's also a part of the war I had, interestingly enough, never really studied in major detail, but it was a part I was intensely curious about from the actual airman's perspective. When you read history books, it's a lot of facts and details about they flew here and they bombed this and this many were shot down and this happened, but you don't get the sort of what is it like to be in the cockpit? What was it like for the ball gunner or the guy on the top or the bombardier? And this show did an amazing job of showcasing like what it was like. And I'll never forget that one of the first scenes when they get over, when Bucky gets over to England. I think it's Bucky gets over to England and he flies his first mission and he gets off and the captain looks at him and goes, when the new guys show up, don't tell them what it's like yet. Just let them be. And to think of this was what my grandfather lived through. It was fantastic. It was so well done.
Can I add the courage of these men? That's one thing that stood out to me for this whole series was how did they go back into the sky? How did they get enough guys willing to get back into that plane after their first mission? After seeing that, after the attrition that they went through, the courage of this generation. It wasn't just the airmen, it was the soldiers on the ground. The idea that these guys just kept going forward because it was the right thing to do. I can't imagine being in that position of those guys and getting into that plane mission after mission, knowing the odds are not in your favor.
Yeah.
It's like the craziness of it and the fact that you're going to be in this plane for 4 hours before the terror hits you, right? Before the terrible thing happens and you're just zooming along in the air.
4 hours of boredom, 30 minutes of terror, and then 4 more hours of boredom.
Yeah.
It really gave you that feel of like immediacy of being in the fuselage, being in the cockpit, and the sheer chaos of like you don't like, especially if you're in one part of the plane where you can't see out, you don't really know what's going on, and there's all this noise, and it's just like, this is terrifying. Like you said, Dom, like how I can't imagine how they got people to do this day in and day out, and the raw courage on display was one of the things that really struck me about this show. Yeah.
And I'd always wondered, a lot of the men who went through World War II didn't want to talk about it afterwards, right? They didn't. And it was always a little confusing to me. Is how come Grandpa didn't talk? He was in a bomber. This is not like dogfighting or anything like that. And then it wasn't like the Pacific where it was just like terrible. But then you see it and you're like, oh, I get it. Like, I get why I would never want to talk about that again.
One of the things that I found out about the show is according to one of the writers, John Orloff, he said that every bomber that goes down is based on a real bomber and a real crew. And so for him writing this, every time he had to write, and this plane goes down, he knows that's not just a plane. That's 10 guys who just made that ultimate sacrifice every time. And so if I watch this again, which maybe I will someday, as I see each of those planes go down, it's going to have that impact. It's not just a director says, more planes, have more planes exploding. No, that's real. That's exactly what it was like.
That's really commendable that they didn't just fill the sky with like imaginary planes, that each one of them is based off a real. And this is jumping ahead a little bit, but that one day where they essentially get wiped out.
Yeah.
And there's that one crew there, and they're like, what about B-17 XYZ? And they're like, nope, didn't make it. What about ABC? Didn't make it.
Was that Rosie's plane that got back was the one plane that returned? Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, and they're sitting there in the debriefing or the afterwards, and did you see this plane? No, I didn't see it.
Did you see any shoots?
Did you see anybody bail out? Yeah.
Oh, man, that was hard to watch. They're called the Bloody 100th because, and I don't know if you guys knew, they were the most, like they had the most casualties of any American air group in England. Like they suffered the most casualties. So it wasn't this bad for every group, but it was nearly as bad for most. It was wild.
Yeah, and they call it the Flying Fortress, but you really see in this show how fragile they are.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and even small arms fire pierces the hull because they have to keep it light. It's an aircraft. It can't have armor all over it. It's covered in machine guns, but
it's got aluminum. It's all aluminum. It's
aluminum.
Yeah.
That's tinfoil protecting you.
You think about, they've got a whole ton of machine guns on this thing, and they're just shooting fire everywhere. But then you see how fast the German planes are going around them. Like the side gunners just trying to keep up. And like, how are they not accidentally shooting the other flying fortresses?
I thought the same thing.
You barely see those fighters.
Right.
They whiz in and out of frame in like a second. I'm just like, what was that? I'm like, how would you hope to hit anything?
And because until the P-51 showed up, the fighter planes based in England, the Allied fighter planes, the American fighter planes, did not have the range, and you didn't have aerial refueling or anything like that back then. Mm-hmm. These bombers were going in on their own. And basically the tactic was send a whole bunch so that some get through.
Yes,
it's amazing.
And the other crazy thing about that is, while the British are doing nighttime bombing and are essentially doing carpet bombing, because at night there's not really a chance you're going to hit what you're aiming at, so they do saturation bombing. The Americans are like, no, we'll fly during the day because we have this fancy bomb site, the Norden bomb site, which costs more to develop than the plane. In fact, I think I even heard somewhere that developing the Norton bomb site cost more than the Manhattan Project.
Oh, wow.
Because it's essentially a computer. Yeah. But unlike it's an analog computer, but it's a computer. And unlike other computers of the time, which would fill like a room, this was like maybe a shoebox sized thing. And it was apparently the most advanced computer on the planet.
It was calculating based on the airspeed of the plane and its altitude, the impact point of a bomb dropped from this moment, and would show so that the bombardier looking through the sight would see a target reticle where the bomb would land if dropped at this point. Now, we're talking of 80 years ago technology. There was not precision bombing, even with it. And and so they had to drop a lot of bombs to hit, and the bombs went everywhere, but better than what the British were doing, which is basically heave a ton of stuff in the general direction and hope some of it hits.
But what the Americans were doing was, to the British, insane, because they're like, okay, when we go over, the Germans didn't have a whole lot of radar, so they had very few night fighters. Like, they didn't put radar into a lot of their planes. But you're going through the day where there's going to be anti-aircraft fire and fighters everywhere. You have to be insane to do that. So the Americans were taking so much heavier losses from day bombing, but they figured it was worth it because they're like, we want to actually destroy this factory we're aiming at. Like,
right. We want to actually hit the target. It also reflects a different philosophy, because the British Bomber Command, that was their equivalent of 8th Air Force, Bomber Command, their strategy was hurt the civilians. If we had lost the war, I'm convinced that they would have been the war criminals, because they were bombing cities. They knew they were bombing the cities because they wanted to cause enough pain to the civilian population that they would force the German high command to surrender, which wasn't going to happen. But that was their strategy.
And you see the evolution of that.
Yeah.
Even in the American 8th Air Force, because they start out saying, okay, we are targeting these U-boat pens. We are targeting this factory. And then that one day where they all come into the briefing room and they're like, no, we are targeting the neighborhood where the railroad workers live. And they're like, why? And they're like, if we kill all the railroad workers, they can't rebuild the railroad marshaling yard that we're going to destroy. And you can see that everyone has a problem with, oh, and by the way, there's a cathedral in this neighborhood too.
Right.
And
it's churches right there, and we're dropping stuff awfully close to where a lot of people are going to be.
On a Sunday.
Right.
Yeah.
And
on a Sunday.
Those workers, they don't live alone. They're not all single adult men. Their families are going to be there. And these guys all know it. Yeah, that's...
And what I like about this, and I have this here in my notes, what I like about this show is that it does nothing to diminish or discredit the courage of these men.
Yes.
But it also shows the bad moral decisions of the people higher up the food chain than them. Because, after the war, the church came down pretty clear on this. I actually have a quote here from the Catechism of the Catholic Church where they quote Gaudium et Spes, which is a Vatican II document. So that's in the late 60s, which says, every act of war directed to the indiscriminate destruction of whole cities or vast areas with their inhabitants is a crime against God and man, which merits firm and unequivocal condemnation. And then it continues, a danger of modern warfare is that it provides the opportunity to those who possess modern scientific weapons, especially atomic, biological, or chemical weapons, to commit such crimes. Now, in World War II, they were working on the atomic bomb. They hadn't finished it yet until by the end of the war. But they're essentially doing mass destruction anyway, just with a ton of bombs. So it's after the war, and having witnessed all this, they're like, okay, this is not part of just war theory. But at the same time, these men had no choice in it. They're being given directives to do. And they know that what they're going to do it will end the war quicker. In other words, like it doesn't make these men into scapegoats. Right. It doesn't diminish their courage or loyalty to their country or any of that. And that's what I think this show did perfectly. It showed what happened on the ground. There were several episodes where we saw busted up German cities and what happened to people.
I'm really glad they showed those scenes of the destruction in both. We saw destruction in London. There was a couple of scenes of that, which I'm glad we saw. Right. But also, they paralleled that with the destruction on the mainland in Germany. And the reaction of the civilians to the airmen, there was a couple of times
the lynch mob scene. Yeah.
And just, I can understand it. Like when these guys are dropping the bombs, they're literally at 30,000 feet. They don't see people. They know they're intellectually they're there, but now they're confronted with the people who are suffering at the hands of maybe not them specifically, but others like them, or may have suffered in previous bombing raids. And so to see the faces of the people, that's the great thing about this story is it's not glorifying war. It does. In fact, it's the opposite. But it also isn't saying all war is bad, all war is unjust, because there was, as I'm sure we'll talk about, we get clear visual evidence of one of the horrors of the Nazi regime, which Band of Brothers did a similar thing with. And so we understand the Nazis are the bad guys here.
Yep, there's no moral equivalence
right.
in this show. Oh, and I should mention, I forgot to mention, the catechism reference I cited for anyone who's ever interested is paragraph 2314. Just because I know people might ask, so I just wanted to have the actual reference there. But yeah, it doesn't make a moral equivalency. You see the Holocaust. And it's so you know that I don't know who needs to know this today, but I'm sure there are people. The Nazis were the aggressors. They're trying to take over the world and exterminate people. But at the same time, yeah, it shows how war, the grinding effects of it, even on democracies, like what lengths democracies are willing to go to and the things that they'll do in order to shorten the conflict. Wow. I would not want to be one of the people having to make such decisions.
Yeah, the more you study the war, the more you understand how both sides, without, again, making a moral equivalency, but how the good guys were also making bad decisions where the ends was justifying the means. War is not clean. It is never clear.
And they're human anyway.
Yes.
So the effects of sin affects everybody. But yeah, I really got, and speaking of that, you saw these men as fully fleshed out human beings. That's the other thing I liked about it. And how they didn't try to make them 21st century men.
They were men of their time.
What do you guys think about the authenticity of this show? That's what I loved about it. It just felt authentic.
They weren't guys, like you said, they weren't 21st century men pretending to be World War II heroes. They felt like men of their time who acted the way they did, but it also didn't criticize them for being men of their time. If they had outdated views on things or what have you, it just presented them. And they are the way they are because they live in the time they live. And let's just leave it at that. That was how they presented them. And so I really enjoyed. I don't know if I recognized any of these actors from other things, the younger actors anyway, from other things that they had done, which seems to be a tradition in the Band of Brothers, the Pacific, and this one. You have a lot of new, fresh faces, and I think they all did.
I knew
great.
Buck was Elvis, and that I couldn't unsee that. I haven't seen that Elvis movie, but I know he was Elvis because I'm like, where have I seen this guy? And then I remembered the trailers for Elvis, and I'm like, and then I couldn't unsee it. He was just Elvis for me.
Oh, he was also Fade Rotha in the most recent Dune movie.
I thought that was him. But with all the makeup, I was unsure.
Yeah. It took me like about 10 minutes into the scene on Gidi Prime, and I'm like, wait a minute. That's Buck. Oh.
Well, Crosby is John Wilkes Booth in the Apple TV Plus series Manhunt.
Oh, is he? I need to watch that, actually.
It's good. I've been watching it. It's really good. And, man, you hate him. He's a good actor. He's very good. I really enjoyed him. Yeah. I enjoyed them all.
Of these characters, let's get into that. Do either of you have a favorite character in this show? One whose story really grabbed you and that you wanted to see have a good ending and all that stuff?
I loved Rosie Rosenthal. Especially once I saw his story. So he's Jewish, Rosie, and my grandfather on my mom's side is Jewish too, and so I have an affinity for Judaism and Jews because of the family ties. And Rosie, Like he shows up, I think in the third or fourth episode. He's not like from the beginning. And he shows up like a newbie. He's like totally raw and fresh and wide-eyed. And he quickly progresses. And this guy's a hero. So the rule was 25 missions and you get to go home. That was the rule because they knew that these guys needed something to live for. They needed some metric to go home. He did his 25 and he said, I can't go home and hang out knowing these guys are still out here. In real life, he flew 52 total missions, which is amazing. And so I really love that. He gets shot down behind the German-Russian lines, rescued by Russians, and
Coca-Cola. I love what he's telling them.
Yeah.
Yes.
Americans.
Stalin.
Hollywood, Coca-Cola.
And he's the one who sees the concentration camp when he's with the Russians and sees the horrors and the evidence. But I loved that encounter he had with the refugees and the Jewish man and how the guy was like, he was in shock. He just, like, where do I go? I have nothing left. All of my family is gone. And where is God in this? And it was.
Yeah, he said God has forgotten us.
Yes. And I could imagine as a Christian, God weeps in that moment because God hasn't forgotten you. God loves you. He weeps at the sin and the horrors perpetrated upon you by his other children.
And these are his people. Jesus became a Jewish man. This is his people. And like you said, Dom, I just imagine that Jesus wept, like it says in the Gospels, to see that this have to happen to his very own people.
Can I read you a little bit about the real Rosie Rosenthal, like his story? Because it's awesome. So he was born in Brooklyn, got a law degree. Yeah, got a law degree at Brooklyn Law School, and was working at a Manhattan law firm on Pearl Harbor Day. Enlisted in the military the next day, flew 52 missions, shot down twice, received more than a dozen military awards, including 2 Purple Hearts, Distinguished Service Cross, and 2 Silver Stars. After the war, he joined the prosecution team at the Nuremberg trials. He went back into legal practice, where he interrogated Hermann Goering during his trial.
Man.
Whoa.
During the ocean voyage from New York to Nuremberg, aboard the ship, he met Phyllis Heller, a fellow lawyer who had served in the U.S. Women's Naval Reserve. They married in Nuremberg and honeymooned at the Eagle's Nest. this Jewish couple who just got married, Hitler's secret retreat in the mountains of southern Germany.
Wow.
Which is awesome. What a great story, just right there. But I really loved the portrayal of Rosie in this one. He wasn't bombastic. He just was a man going to work. You know what I mean? And he had his struggles. I like the episode where they sent him to this spa sort of place to get
like
themselves
a British mansion.
Yeah, and it was designed to help like the bomber crews unwind or what have you, or recuperate a little bit. But I don't know. He really resonated with me.
Yeah, and he didn't want to be there. He just wanted to go back, be in the fight. Yeah. He's just, I feel useless sitting here. And he has those conversations with the doctor.
Yes.
That are really interesting. Pat, did you have a favorite character?
So mine is a combination between Buck and Bucky. And the reason is because they both remind me of different aspects of my grandfather. My grandfather, he had a past with alcohol. He had problems, maybe in the war or after the war. And he struggled a lot in kind of the same way Bucky does with sort of the horror of it all and the terrible things happening to his guys. Like that scene where Bucky's in London and he finds out about Buck, and he on the phone, he's just, "Are we going to bat tomorrow?" And they're like, "Yeah." And he's, "Put me up. I'm in the lineup." And I could see my grandfather doing that. And at the same time, he wasn't like overly emotional. He was a very calm, sort of reserved guy like Buck. Also, he dressed more like Buck. Kept his hair short and no mustache, and didn't smile a ton. There's this joke about my grandfather whenever they took pictures of him. They tell him to smile, and he just, through his gritted teeth, "I am smiling, damn it."
That's like another Dune reference. It's like Gurney Halleck. Smile, Gurney.
Yeah. So, and as it was really good to see, especially Bucky's progression through the war, him coming into it, what happens, him losing it, coming back, and then what happens in the POW camp after they get shot down, how he deals with being there, how he deals with the other men. And he is very clearly imperfect, right? He is very clearly a man who is just struggling with the whys of life. Like, why am I here? Why are we doing this? Why is this happening to us? Why? But then also, I'm getting back in the plane and we're going to finish this.
He despairs at a few points. Like, you could tell he's given up on the idea that he's going to survive the war. He just assumes he's going to die. He's just become fatalistic in it. But he's also like hot-headed. He's arrogant. He's super self-confident. And that contrast with Buck, who is calm, confident. He doesn't swear. He doesn't drink, which reminded me a lot of Damian Lewis's character in Band of Brothers. And I felt like when this started, I thought that Buck was going to be the Dick Winters of this one, because Dick Winters was the hero of Band of Brothers. It's an ensemble, but he's the guy you really, for me anyway, stuck with throughout. I mean, he felt like the hero to me. Whereas this was much more ensemble. You did get spread out a bit more, but Buck was calm in the air and in command, unfazed by things. And Bucky was hot-headed. But I think they made a great pair when they were together, when they were working together.
All those scenes were magic.
Yeah, Buck tempers Bucky, and Bucky motivates Buck. There's that. Was it iron sharpens sword? I forget what iron sharpens iron, whatever it is.
Iron sharpens iron.
That phrase. They did that for each other. So I agree. It's such a great pairing.
I really liked Buck because Buck, to me, you're right, Dom. He was the Dick Winters of this show, because just Dick Winters with Buck, I was like, this is a guy I'd follow to hell and back.
Yes.
And people did for real.
Yes.
And you could see why they did it, because he's just a natural good leader. And you're just like, yeah, I would follow this guy no matter what. Because you could tell, like you said, he wasn't fazed by anything, but he cared deeply about his men. And I just got, this is a solid, good guy. And I loved his backstory. The reason why he doesn't drink, he doesn't smoke, he doesn't gamble, is because his own father had problems with all those things. And they lived on the street because of his dad's gambling problem. And it's not even just gambling. He hates sports because his dad bet on sports.
Right.
On sports.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. And
him.
Yeah.
I also liked Cross. I liked Crosby because, especially in the early episodes, I'm like, I would basically be him. I would be terrified and airsick and not know what to do during those missions.
I'm hit. Oh, wait, it's my own.
It's my own. The helmet full of
I would be that guy who accidentally upchucks in somebody's helmet, then they put it on, and they're like, oh, But I loved Crosby's arc of going from that guy with no confidence to being given, because he's also just naturally just good at what he does. He's bumped up into that position of, like, at first he's, they've given me a desk job, but he's been given this responsibility of making sure the whole wing of bombers has their coordinates and all that stuff. And then he throws himself into that to the point where he's not sleeping.
Right.
He's taking all these, like, pills and stuff to stay awake because they're planning for D-Day, to the point where he just falls over one day because I think it was like a week or something he wasn't sleeping.
Right.
And yeah, he's not perfect either. He has that affair with the English intelligence agent, mystery woman. Yeah. And like, I mean, he has a wife and a little kid at home. So again, they show the flaws of these men, but that in the core of them, that they're good men. They're solid men. They care about one another, and they're loyal to their country, and they're trying to save lives by what they do. And yeah, so many of these characters, even some of the characters who didn't make it, I liked.
So Crosby, what was interesting about him is so his He wrote a book that the series was partially based on as well, and he became the narrator. Like, it was his narrator voice. So he was the voice of the series in a sense. He became the viewpoint. But you're right. I really liked Crosby because a lot of these guys, when they came back, they were against war because they seen it. They'd done it. They didn't think we should do it again for petty reasons. He actually was actively in later years against the Vietnam War, but he also he helped set up the curriculum at the Air Force Academy when it formed. He became a professor, and he lived not far from where I am now. He lived in Newton, Mass for many years and taught at Boston University. I think he was there when I was there. I was only there for a year, but I think he was there when I was there. But he taught English, so I wouldn't have been in unless he taught freshman English. I was an engineering major. That didn't last long. So I really liked the Crosby story because it was different. He wasn't the flashy pilot. I almost said pirate. Pilot on the front seat. He's the navigator, and he was the navigator who got the desk job, and it gave an interesting perspective. He kept sending these guys off, and when he lost his buddy, the guy who replaced him in the plane, when they switched positions, Bubbles, and like he got the letter. Was it the letter from his wife or from Bubbles?
But it was the letter that Bubbles had written to Crosby's wife when he thought Crosby was dead.
Oh, that's what it was.
Because there was remember, they had crashed before on the edge of the ocean in England.
Yes.
And that whole crew had to be like ferried back via people who had cars. They spent the night in some farmer's cabin and then found a phone the next day. But he had thought Crosby was dead, and he had to write a letter to his wife. And so after Bubbles dies, Crosby goes and finds the letter and reads it.
Right.
That was an amazing scene.
Yeah. And I think there's also another letter at another point where like his wife writes to Crosby and says, "Say hi to Bubbles for me," before she knows.
Bubbles, yeah.
And it's wow, like the burden that these guys carried. Who was the young man who fell for the USO girl? There was that
on like day one.
Yeah, the series was well written, but as soon as I saw that, I'm like, oh, he's toast. This is going to be the tragedy.
And one character who I got attached to, I think Kurt was his name. He died. Remember, like he stayed with his co-pilot as the plane was going down. Then they smash head first into a field, and the plane blows up. I was like, no, I liked that character. You know, like, this is what happened in real life. That lieutenant perished. Yeah, and he does a real heroic thing. Or the awful choice that the one kid has to make to leave the guy in the ball turret behind.
Yep.
Oh my gosh, that was terrifying.
And the poor kid in the turret. That reminded me, did you guys ever see the original Steven Spielberg Amazing Stories from back in the 80s?
Some of them. I remember
There
those.
was an episode by Spielberg. I don't know which one of the B bombers it was, but let's say it was a B-17. But had a ball gunner, and he was like an artist, or someone on board was like a cartoonist. And the whole premise was the landing gear was damaged. They were going to have to land on their belly, and the ball turret was damaged that he couldn't get out. So he was going to get smushed when the plane. So it was the crew survives, or he dies, or they all die. And so as they're coming in, I don't know. I forget. It's been 40 years since I've seen this, but there was something about the cartoonist basically drew. He had a drawing of the plane, and he drew wheels with the landing gear down, and cartoonish landing wheels show up on the actual plane. And they bounce down like it's animation. It's a supernatural story, sort of fictional thing. It wasn't like a real. It was an amazing story. So it's like a tale. Would you believe?
I remember that one though.
Yeah, that
was a really good. That stuck with me so much because I remember it coming back to me while I was watching the show. I think where did I hear about that or read that?
Yes. So, and it was Spielberg there too. And Spielberg was behind this. I don't know if he had any input into this, but yeah, that idea, like the guys who had to get into the ball, like they had to be small and they had to be bundled up because they're basically out in the cold on the outside of the plane at 40,000 feet. It's 30, 40 degrees below zero. They're like bundled up in all their woolens and freezing in there and cramped in this little claustrophobic space.
And the shrapnel almost hits the one ball turret gunner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I flinched. I was like, oh, whoa, okay.
And they weren't actually any shorter than any of the other guys.
Really?
Really?
The average ball turd gunner height was about the same as everybody else's.
Wow.
Yeah, because you just think, okay, these have to be small guys.
Yeah, you said a small guy in there.
I mean, if there were a small guy in the crew, that's who I'd put in there. But yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
And Dom, you mentioned artists. We had one artist among the characters in this show. One of the Tuskegee Airmen was an artist. I believe it was the Alexander Jefferson. I think he was the artist.
Yeah.
Yeah, because late in the series, they introduced the Tuskegee Airmen. Because by this point in the war, like 44, they finally rolled out the P-51 Mustang, which has the range and the speed to keep up with the B-17s and to provide fighter cover. And one of the most decorated P-51 squadrons was the Tuskegee Airmen, and because the Air Force was still segregated at this point, so you had an all African-American squadron. And I felt that they handled that so well.
It was not gratuitous. It wasn't just these guys were in they were Tuskegee Airmen. They were red tails. They were called red tails because the tail of their plane was painted red so that the Germans could see them. They were very brash. They won't mistake us. But some of those guys were actually in the same POW camp with the Bloody 100th guys. So that's how they incorporated them. But yeah, some of the actors, did you notice that Ncuti Gatwa was in this? He was Daniels. Ncuti Gatwa was the new doctor in Doctor Who.
Yeah.
Very different character from what he usually plays, like a bubbly, happy-go-lucky sort of guy. Very different character in this one. But I think they all did really well. It was really good.
And they show when they first introduced them that they're like, we are not getting promoted. We're doing all this work, and we are not getting promoted. So you can see the
discrimination.
That's it. Yeah, the discrimination that's going on. But at the same time, they keep at it because they're like, we are going to prove to these people that we are the best.
Right. We're Americans.
And it was, at this point, it was a fair oddity to have African Americans in combat functions, right? Because they could be part of the armed forces, but they were usually reserved as cooks or
truck drivers.
Truck drivers or ammunition folks. And so giving one of these guys a P-51, that had to be, somebody had to do some real maneuvering within the Air Force, the Army Air Corps / Air Force, to really get these guys where they needed to be.
Yes.
And the Germans are so stupid when they capture them, by the way. And being Nazis, they resort to stereotypes. They turn on their record player and they're like, you like jazz music. And I'm like, really?
That's racist. I want to do like the meme. Look at the kid pointing. That's racist.
They just
Nazis.
think that. And I love when he says, why do you fight for a country that treats you so poorly? And the Tuskegee Airman just looks at the Nazi like he's insane. Because he is.
Because we're fighting you.
People. Yeah, because we're fighting you who would exterminate somebody like me. Like, and like he says, I'm fighting for America to become the place I know it can be.
That was such a great line.
That was great.
I wanted to stand up and cheer because that's right. That's why these guys did it. Not because America was what it should be, regrettably. It's because America could be that still, whereas the Nazis were not going to wear in that direction.
No.
I really liked. We talked about the two bombing scenes where we see the aftermath of the bombing in London and then in Germany. I loved how they showed all of the interrogations.
Yes.
They showed Bucky's interrogation and the Tuskegee Airmen's interrogation and how very similar they all were. Despite their difference in who they were and what air groups they were part of, what kind of bombing missions they were on. That was like, yeah, that's America.
Speaking of those interrogations, the idea that the Germans had detailed information on every one of these guys, that's true. They had spies in America who were digging up information on every pilot they could find. They knew what street you lived on, and it was amazing in an era pre-computers. Like this all had to be done on the ground. But
that's how they knew that stuff.
Yeah,
because that confused me.
Because they had spies everywhere. Like all those propaganda posters about the walls have ears and all that sort of stuff. That was true. It was true that they did have spies everywhere, and there were Americans of German descent who were helping the homeland. There were traders in this country who were sending that information back, which reminds me of that Band of Brothers scene where there was they were after on D-Day where they run into that soldier who's an American in the German unit. Who's from the hometown, and they're catching up. Oh, I just live on such and such street. Like, oh yeah,
they're like, why are you even here? And he's, he went back to the fatherland or whatnot. And
it's just because before World War II, people didn't. It wasn't like, oh, I would never work for the Nazis. It was like people didn't understand at that point necessarily. There are Ukrainian Americans who've gone back to Ukraine to fight the Russians. You know what I mean? Like, it happens. Like, your homeland is under attack. You go and fight for it. And that's what some Americans were doing. But
at that time, the bulk of the American population wasn't that far removed from their ancestral homeland.
Yep.
I claim I'm like a quarter and quarter Irish and a quarter German, but we're talking 5 or 6 generations to go back that far. These people were either immigrants themselves or one generation down.
I am told that some of my Italian side of the family, that great-grandparents or such and such, had a portrait of Mussolini in their house. And they were like, put that away. End up in an internment camp. But it's like,
right.
And you would think you left that place because it was poor and run by a dictator, and that's why you came to America. Why would you have this in your house? But it's
hard to explain those ties that people have. Mm-hmm. And again, pre-World War II, fascism, communism, those were not the dirty words they are today. They were just, for a lot of people, they were just another. Today, you call someone a fascist is one of the worst things you can do. Call someone a communist. There are certain circles where it's not so bad, but but in general, it's not a nice thing. But before World War II, those were not dirty words yet, and so that's one of the things that I love about these shows, whether it's Masters of the Air, Band of Brothers. It helps us to get into the context of the time.
Yeah,
they were at their best when they help us to understand the people and the way that they approached life and the world and the way they thought. Because like you said earlier, these aren't 21st century men in a 1940s context. They are men of their time, and we are experiencing what it was like for them. And that's why I read history. That's why I love to read history books, because I want to understand. And I think Masters of the Air is great at that.
What do you guys think? I guess we'll finally get to the comparison question in terms of this show compared to its predecessors, because it's a spiritual sequel to Band of Brothers and the Pacific. Do you have a favorite among these shows?
I would say Masters of the Air is probably my favorite. It's hard for me to break away from my own family history. Both my grandfathers retired as colonels from the Air Force. My wife's grandfather was in the Air Force. My dad, his twin brother, and then his other brother all flew in the Air Force. They were all pilots after that. I unfortunately inherited an inner ear issue from my mom, so I couldn't do piloting or astronautics like I wanted to be an astronaut. So I just got my aerospace engineering degree so I could someday maybe design rockets. But I deal with giant gas turbines now, so close. It's just so in our blood, my family's. And so I loved everything about it. And it's nothing to take away from Band of Brothers of the Pacific. I think as far as how it really was, I don't think you can get better than the Pacific, because it really shows how terrible it was for those guys. And it's tough. Band of Brothers was so good. And it wasn't like, quote unquote, the first of its kind, but it really was. Yeah. But Masters of the Air is probably my favorite.
For me, so I watched Band of Brothers for the first time a year ago. Like, I was very late to the game. I knew I should watch it, but I just hadn't yet. And so I finally got around to it, and it was blown away. And I love it. It still ranks first for me. There's something about, as good as this cast was, that cast was perfect. There was something about the chemistry, all the actors. It's from 20 years later, looking where these actors have gone, all the actors from Band of Brothers, and it was something perfect about it. Masters of the Air is a close second for me because, again, it recaptured a lot of what made Band of Brothers so great, and it gave us so much. The Pacific comes in third for me, partly because I don't know, maybe it was pretty brutal, and there's a few scenes of that which still stick out in my mind, like the images from it that I wish I didn't have stuck in my head, but are there. And which isn't to say that wasn't what those guys went through. But the ending of the Pacific felt a little unsatisfying to me. The return home. That's the difference between Masters of the Air and the other two, is we didn't get the return home as much as we did in those. The return home of Band of Brothers, I think, was superior to that in the Pacific. I don't know. It felt unsatisfying to me for some reason. So, but all that said, so for me, it's Band of Brothers, Masters of the Air, and then the Pacific.
Yes, as much as I love Band of Brothers, and I love it, and that was a show that my brother and I bonded over watching, and because we're both World War II buffs, and and especially because it was in Europe and there were Battle of the Bulge episodes, and we knew that our grandfather was in that battle, that it was a way, and we didn't know him. He died before we were born. So it was a way for us to connect with him and stuff. So there's a nostalgia factor to Band of Brothers. I think Masters of the Air is my new favorite, because there are episodes of Band of Brothers that I go back to pretty often. But there are also episodes that I'll skip. Like, I won't watch the whole series through. Whereas with Masters of the Air, there was not a single episode where I felt like, on rewatch, I'll skip this one. Like, to me, it was that solid all the way through, and it was gripping all the way through. And
that's true for me as well. There's at least one episode of Band of Brothers where I probably wouldn't bother with. The one where they followed that other guy, the cowardly guy. And
Blythe?
Yeah, which, by the way, they got entirely wrong.
Happened. Yeah,
they got him totally wrong. And in fact, they say in the epilogue of the episode that he died. No, he didn't. No. He actually went out to serve in Korea and Vietnam with distinction.
And they also, with Spears, exaggerated his ruthlessness. In fact, there's a new book out about Captain Spears called Fierce Valor, which I haven't read yet, but is on my list.
Oh, interesting.
He sounds like such an interesting person in real life. But this show, it was a ray of hope to me that, yes, big Hollywood and big entertainment can still make shows like this.
Right. Another movie, so it's just a movie that is a cousin to these three, is Greyhound, the Tom Hanks, where he was the captain, was a destroyer escort. Yeah, escorting the Liberty ships against the Wolf Pack. Another one that's in the same spiritual vein, but doesn't descend into the maudlin and stuff. But it's about this. It was very good. I'd say it has the same vein of this one, and they all descend from Saving Private Ryan. That's as the granddaddy of them all.
And that's Steven Spielberg too, and he's been involved in all these three. So I feel like that him directing he did direct Saving Private Ryan.
Oh yeah.
So that but his influence can be seen in these series.
Yeah, totally.
And the other series I think I would mention, it's going to seem odd, but it's called From Earth to the Moon. And it was an HBO, and it was a Tom Hanks. It's the one he did after Apollo 13. And it's all the Apollo guys, and it's them through it basically starts with Apollo 1, the fire, and moves forward from there. And it's in the same, it's almost, you have Apollo 13, and then From the Earth to the Moon, and then you have Saving Private Ryan and Band of Brothers, and it's the same basic thing, and same platform. So I would almost put that show within this realm. Different kind of war, but
the Cold War, trying to beat the Russians.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. That's exactly what it is.
Nice.
So do you guys have any final kind of wrap-up thoughts about this show? Oh gosh, what more can we could go on for hours about the show. But
I had a couple other notes. One is the entire series of Band of Brothers, the time span of that takes place between episodes 8 and 9 of Masters of the Air. So the time span, pretty much, except for the training, is interesting. We didn't talk a lot about their time in the PW camp, but just the imperative to escape, the planning that they went through, the ingenuity of, it was like, I don't know if you guys have ever saw Hogan's Heroes from the 60s.
I know nothing.
I know nothing. Click, you idiot.
Click.
Anyway. Colonel Hofstadter. That was totally in my wheelhouse. Anyway, we didn't see a lot of that, but it was very interesting to see the connections between them and the camp guards, how the Luftwaffe was in charge of the prison camps first, and they were like, you don't want the SS to show up to be in charge of the camps. And just to see that imperative to escape and how Buck helped the others get away, and Bucky. I know in real life their nicknames were Buck and Bucky, but it's still confusing.
It's confusing.
Yeah.
But help them get away, and just that final scene when the liberation is right there.
Oh, I got emotional in that scene. Yeah,
and
American
get the flag.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that was such an amazing. I'm like, go.
My brother and I joked too about the camp scenes that the German guards seem to only know 3 words of English, and that is in, out, and now.
Yes.
In now, out now.
Yes. So the POW camp scenes were good too. They added a lot to it because so many of the POWs, the POWs in Germany in World War II were airmen shot down. It wasn't so much the soldiers the on the ground until later, but for a lot of them, it was the guys in the air.
What about you, Pat? Any wrap-up thoughts?
Yeah, I think that would be my final stuff was about the POW stuff because we didn't cover it so much. I love during the liberation and you hear the plane first. And it's funny because I cocked my ear and I'm like, that's a P-51. And immediately the Tuskegee Airmen, that's a P-51. Nailed it.
Yes.
Nailed it. Yeah.
As soon as those tanks rolled up, I was like, oh, this is over and done with. This camp is liberated.
Yeah.
Yeah. I liked what they showed about the slow dissolution of Germany from the inside, how they had to go from camp to camp. They had to keep marching, and how it got more dangerous to march at night because they were going to get shot by their own people. And that scene where they're on the road and the German guys who are going out to the front come by, and the one German officer is looking at them, and it's all old men and children.
Yep.
Like, we're done for. That's it. We've lost. And that scene was just so good and chilling and spot on.
And when the one German officer almost collapses and the American airman helps him get up, and he's just, danke, thank you.
It's a very human moment.
Yeah.
I love towards the beginning where it's a Luftwaffe or officer, and the SS has requested that we find out all the people who have German or who have Jewish heritage.
Oh yeah, I was like,
and the American is no, we're all Americans here.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
Oh man, yes,
so good.
Yeah, I think that the one other scene that sticks out to me, which kind of has to do with what you said, Pat, about just the dissolution of Germany towards the end, is when those guys who escape. As soon as they introduced that new guy who was a friend of Buck, I was like, oh, he's not going to make it. And he's bayoneted by a Hitler Youth.
Yeah, in the woods. Yeah,
a kid soldier. I mean, that he was he's one of the soldiers that the children that they've put in uniform and
he couldn't have been 12 or 13.
Yeah,
I was like, oh my gosh.
And they didn't even have bullets. They were,
which then confused me why they were afraid when the Americans got their guns.
Right?
Did they not know? Maybe they were told they had ammunition and they really didn't, because there was no ammunition to go around.
Right.
At this point in the war, German trucks are actually burning wood and charcoal. To get around because there's no oil, no nothing. So, but they're still fighting because Hitler.
That jerk. What a jerk.
It's one of my favorite World War II historians, James Holland, likes to say that any sane German government would have capitulated in 1942 or 43. But because it's Hitler, we have to keep going to the bitterest end.
Oh, and the scene where they're dropping supplies.
Operation Chowhound. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
That was also
I cried. I cried so hard.
Because the Germans had basically stripped Holland of all of the food to feed their own people. So the people in Holland were starving to death. And if you've ever read some of the children's literature, my kids have read some of the books set in World War II. And it's like the people were eating tulip bulbs and like just anything that was chewable, even not even really edible. And yet that's the other thing I love is when our guys were shot down over Holland earlier, the Dutch people were the ones who were risking everything, including the girls, to get our airmen out, like south to Spain, I guess they were taking them to, which is a hike.
On some of Father Roderick Van Hogen's podcasts, he's mentioned how the war is still remembered in Holland very intensely. Oh, yeah. And that they make sure in school that they teach this stuff. And there's still remembered.
A lot of gratitude toward toward Americans in Holland. There's still people still celebrate the liberation days.
Mm-hmm. But we could just go on and on about this stuff because we're all three so much interested in this.
Yeah.
But we want to hear from you, our viewers. Have you seen Masters of the Air? What did you think of it? Do you have any family stories? Tell us family stories. Yeah. That would be really cool. We would like to know about that. But we'd also like to take a moment to especially thank our patrons who make this podcast possible, including Stephen B., Carla C., Laura V., Nicholas D., and Richard M. Their generous donations allow us to continue to create the secrets of movies and TV shows and all of our shows here at StarQuest. And you can join them at sqpn.com/give. And again, you can contact us by sending an email to secrets@sqpn.com, or you can comment on our YouTube channel or hit us up on Facebook or X. And you can visit the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/Discord. So until next time, Dom Bettinelli, thank you for joining me in sharing the secrets of Masters of the Air.
It was my pleasure.
And Pat Mason, thank you as well.
Oh, you're very welcome. This was awesome. Thank you.
And once again, I'm Thomas Salerno. Thank you for listening to the secrets of movies and TV shows on StarQuest.
Here's another show on the StarQuest Network you're sure to enjoy, The Catholics of Oz. Find it wherever fine podcasts are found or at sqpn.com/Oz. We'd like to thank Patrick McCaffrey of Moonshadow Studios for editing this episode. To have your audio edited professionally and with care, check out more of Patrick's work at moonshadowstudios.biz. That's moonshadowstudios.biz.